From the campus of Stanford University.
People are worried about data. They're worried about their privacy and their security. They should be. We need secure systems.
This is the future of everything.
But we can't have a system that closes that data off. It is too rich of a source of inspiration, innovation, and discovery for new things in medicine.
With your host, Russ Altman.
Today on The Future of Everything, the future of climate change. So climate change has become, I would say, increasingly difficult to argue with. There just seems to be a lot of evidence. It does seem that the cause of climate change is human activity, but that really may not matter. It's pretty clear that temperatures are rising. If you've seen the historical graphs of average temperature annually at various locations on Earth, they're just going up. We've all seen the pictures, spectacular pictures of polar ice caps melting, sea levels are rising. I think most people are aware of changing weather patterns, where it rains, where it snows, when it snows, where it's dry. That all is changing, and it's changing even in the course of lifetime, so that you remember 10, 15, 20 years ago, if you're old enough, and you remember a different set of weather patterns. There's a lot of discussion on the macro impacts, like on land and geography. I think everybody agrees that Miami and New Orleans and Venice, Italy, in particular, are in big trouble and will be underwater. And in addition, other cities are going to have little pieces of them submerged, and many are considering major infrastructure programs to build levees and channels for water, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But there are other effects of climate change that also need to be considered. There are effects on the food supply, where things grow and how well they grow. Human conflict. When you're really, really thirsty, you get ornery and a little combative. And I don't mean to minimize that. Economic production, availability of fuels, air quality, and impacts on living organisms, plants, bacteria, viruses, but mammals as well. And guess what? Humans are mammals. So there's issues of infant mortality, our mood, our risk for diseases. So there's a need to look at all of this in the setting of climate change so we can understand what's coming, so we can understand how the risks will shift based on where we live and our lifestyles, the environmental impacts, and to be a little bit optimistic here, the plans for interventions and mitigation. What can we do to actually minimize or remove the effects that of bad impacts from climate change? Marshall Burke is a professor of Earth System Science and a center fellow at the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies. Marshall, you have looked at how climate change may impact workplace productivity, of all things. So what can we expect in terms of the workplace, or are we already seeing it?
We're definitely already seeing it.
Damn, I was afraid you would say that.
No, that's right. Folks have been putting people in labs for decades now and cranking up the heat and trying to understand what happens to their productivity. A lot of recent work has looked at test scores, which is a good setting in which to study our cognitive function and how it responds to changes in temperature. And all these studies point to the same sort of finding. When you crank up the temperature, our cognitive function goes down. We do worse at workplace tasks, be they manual labor tasks, which you can sort of imagine, or also sort of higher cognitive function tasks.
Now, are we talking 72 degrees to 92 degrees, or are we talking 72 to 78, or what is the resolution of these differences?
Yeah, so in the lab, you often try to make pretty dramatic differences. So they really crank up the temperature in the lab. In these more natural experiment studies where we look at kids' test scores, there we're looking at smaller changes. And so there we're looking at changes in average temperature of 1 degree or 2 degrees and trying to understand how does that affect what kids learn over the span of a year and how they perform on sort of the standardized tests that then really matter for college entrance.
Yes.
Yeah.
So is this work that you're doing in Earth Systems?
That's right. So we have a broader research agenda that tries to understand the impacts of climate change on a bunch of these different outcomes. So economic productivity is one of them, but as you mentioned in your intro, we're interested in a lot of things beyond just the dollars, the measurements that we typically think of as economists, things like gross domestic product, the sort of key economic statistics. We also want to think about impacts that don't show up in those numbers, things like impacts on human health, on mental health, on human violence. So really trying to build a picture of the broadest picture we can of the full suite of impacts that a changing climate might have.
Yeah. So, and when I look at your the papers that you've written and the work that you've done in your research, it really does cover this huge range. So, how do you think about it? Can you give us a framework for how to think about climate change and the kind of problems you go after? Because I know you do wind up thinking about things like human conflict. Is that the way you start, or is that derivative from a lot of other kind of analyses that you do to look at what the conditions of what the human condition, how that will change, and therefore how that will catalyze conflict? What's the framework?
Yeah, the broad framework, again, is let's cast a wide net and let's think about all the things that matter to humans more broadly, right? What are the outcomes that matter? And then let's try to understand how these could be affected by environmental changes that we're likely to see, and climate change being one of the most important and very salient today. So, we're not the only folks working on this. People have thought about the effects of a changing climate on agriculture in particular for a long time, which makes sense. Food production is immediately affected by changes in climate, and so that's been sort of the traditional jumping off point for how we think about climate impacts.
Is that where the human conflict comes from, or is it more complicated than that?
Well, it's probably part of where the human conflict comes from. So we got into the human conflict exactly from that angle. The idea being that it's at least been hypothesized by social scientists that a lot of the human conflict, the organized human conflict we see around the world, could have economic roots. So if the economy takes a turn for the worse, and in developing countries, the economy is often agricultural. So if agricultural production falls, then people might need to find other ways to make ends meet. And so they could be more likely to take up arms. This is sort of a classic hypothesis now in social sciences about why conflicts start. So if that's true and changes in climate affect agriculture, then it's plausible that changes in climate could foment these broader scale conflicts. And so that's exactly what we've looked for in the data and found a lot of evidence consistent with. So if you look in sub-Saharan Africa or actually across the developing world for the last 2 or 3 decades, we see large responses of civil wars to warmer than average temperatures. So again, if you crank up the temperature, we see more human conflict.
So that's really interesting. So you're doing kind of, it sounds like there's a certain element of big data here. Can you tell me what are the data sources that are available to you, and then how do you correlate them? And then, of course, it always gets to the question of, are these correlations, or can you link them causally, like A causes B causes C?
Exactly, yeah, and that's the whole crux of this. So the data sources are pretty disparate, and we just work with whatever we can get. On the conflict side, for whatever reason, the Scandinavians have been really pushing the envelope on collecting conflict data. They're thought of as a peaceful people, but they're obsessed with conflict data. So there's multiple outfits in various parts of Scandinavia that have put together these amazing conflict event data sets. So we basically know...
Goodness.
Yeah, right?
So it's a database of wars and crimes of violence at a societal scale.
Exactly. And where they happened and when they happened and who is involved.
And what the temperature was, evidently.
So they don't put that together. We put that together separately and merge those two data sets. So now let's say you have data on conflict events and where and when they happen. You have data on what was going on with the climate system, so temperature and rainfall.
Where do you get that, just out of curiosity, the weather data?
So the mix of stuff there. The satellites went up in about the late 70s, early 80s. So we have satellite information on both temperature and precip starting about the late 70s.
Precip is, I think, a term of art for precipitation.
Sorry, precipitation, yes. Rainfall, as normal people call it. Prior to that, what we had was rainfall stations, or temperature stations. And in certain parts of the developing world, these were hard to come by and are still pretty hard to come by. And so we have a pretty sparse record. And so a lot of the art is in trying to figure out how to use that record.
This is the future of everything. I'm Russ Altman. I'm speaking with Marshall Burke about how he and others link conflict data to weather data to draw conclusions about how climate change might affect in the past and in the future the probability of human conflict. So please go on. So you have your weather data, increasingly high tech, but available even back to the 70s and 60s. You have your Scandinavian conflict database. And then what do you find?
Yeah, so again, the crux here is figuring out, distinguishing correlation from causation, right? And so here's the thought experiment you should have in your mind. So let's say you had data on temperature and conflict everywhere in the world. So we talked about Scandinavia. You look at a place like Norway. Norway's been pretty peaceful for the last centuries, since the Vikings, basically. And you have a country like Nigeria that has experienced a lot of conflict and continues to experience conflict before. So Norway, peaceful, fairly cold. Nigeria, more conflict-prone recently, and fairly hot. You would not want to...
And yet many other differences as well.
And yet many other differences, exactly. So you would not want to attribute the differences in conflict between Norway and Nigeria to the differences in temperature, because they differ in all sorts of ways that could also affect conflict. So instead of comparing Norway to Nigeria, what we do is compare Nigeria to itself. We take Nigeria in a year of average temperatures for Nigeria and then compare it to Nigeria in a year where temperatures were warmer than average. And we use these year-to-year fluctuations in temperature, which are at least a large part random, and we try to mimic what we would do in the lab. And of course, we're unable to do that now. It would be both impossible and probably unethical to randomly assign temperature. But we let the climate randomly assign temperature, and we see, okay, do we see more conflicts in years that are hotter than average? And we do that for every country in sub-Saharan Africa or every country in the developing world. And indeed, that's what we find. So when temperatures are warmer than average in Nigeria, we see statistically increases in conflict risk.
And it seems to me that you would also then have to consider the time aspect. So you wouldn't expect a hot day to instantaneously cause a war, but you might expect a hot period with some time lag to lead to an increase. And do you do that kind of modeling or temporal relationships?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So we try to think about what the again, in the parlance, the lag structure would look like. So what is the temperature that you would care about? Is it the immediate temperature? Is it the accumulation of hot days? And on some level, this is an empirical question. We don't know exactly what that relationship would look like. So we sort of, with enough data, we can let the data tell us. So what is the temperature that matters for these events that we see? Sometimes no temperatures matter, and these things are not affected. Otherwise, we see that temperatures during the agricultural growing season are the most important for explaining the conflict links. And when you see a signal like that, you might conclude that then this agricultural pathway that we talked about is the thing that's linking climate to these conflict outcomes.
Does your data allow you to say that the hotter it is, the worse the chances of conflict, or is that a level of detail that you can't get to? So is a 10-degree difference worse than a 5-degree difference?
So for human violence more broadly, and this is true in the civil conflict context we've been talking about in sub-Saharan Africa, it's also true if you look at violent conflict, personal conflict in the U.S.
Like crime rates.
Crime rates, things like aggravated assault and homicide in the U.S. You see this surprisingly linear relationship, right? So a 2-degree increase is going to have a larger effect than a 1-degree increase, and a 3-degree increase. So it's linear. So as you crank up the temperature, no matter what your average temperature is, if you crank up the temperature, you're going to see more of these types of human conflict.
It seems to me that helps your argument about causality. It goes back even to like when they were trying to prove that bacteria infections cause disease, that when the dose correlates with the amount of response, that doesn't prove causation, but it's a big brick in the kind of edifice of causation. This is the future of everything. I'm Russ Altman. I'm speaking with Marshall Burke. Marshall Burke. This is the future of everything. I'm Russ Altman. I'm speaking with Marshall Burke about climate change and its impact on human civil conflict as well as crime. So let's talk a little bit about crime. Hot times, summer in the city. Is that the problem?
So that appears to be part of the problem. That's right. Colleagues and I published some research on this, and it came out, and some of the reporters interviewed these police chiefs in some big cities, and their response, big cities in the Midwest, and their response was, we don't need some stupid Stanford professor to tell us that crime goes up on hot nights, right? So this is something that's been observed for a long time. With enough data, we can show it's a very strong empirical regularity, not just in large cities and not just in the summertime. Actually, again, we see this very strong linear relationship So it doesn't matter if you warm up the temperature on a cold day or you warm up the temperature on a hot day, we see increases in various types of human conflict. So this is typically violent conflict, aggravated assault, homicide, really bad stuff. These go up when the temperature is warm.
Now, I think a lot of us are tempted to think, yeah, it's hot, you're sweaty, you get cranky, and like there's violence. But do we understand the physiological, and I don't know if this is something that a professor of Earth system science would study, but do we understand what goes on in the human brain under these conditions to actually trigger these kinds of events?
Yeah, so there's two main hypotheses. One, as you mentioned, so let's say statistically we see this link between hot temperatures and violence, right? So what's going on? One story is this physiological link that you mentioned. There's the biology of human behavior is changing as you crank up the temperature. Another explanation is social, right? Our social patterns of engagement change when you crank up the temperature. So I used to live in San Francisco. If it gets above 70 degrees in San Francisco, everyone's out on the street. It's like the warmest day ever, right? So clearly your patterns of engagement change, and that could trigger some of these interactions. To be honest, we don't totally know the answer. It's probably a combination of both. And as a professor of Earth System Science, I'm probably least equipped to comment on the biology of the brain. However, this is, to me, a critical topic for future research because another finding of ours suggests that it's likely, again, or at least very plausible, that something in the brain is going on. So not only do we see relationships between hot temperatures and interpersonal violence, so me punching Russ, we also see relationships between hot temperatures and what people do to themselves. So, and this is, again, sort of a terrible finding on some level, but we see suicide rates go up when temperatures increase as well. So that's not interpersonal violence, it's just sort of personal violence. And again, it's likely the case that something fundamental in the brain is changing as we change the temperature.
And speaking of this fundamental human response, I take it that based on your comments about Scandinavia and sub-Saharan Africa, this seems to be a universal trait among humans. It's not a particular Western, Eastern, African. You're seeing this across the globe.
That's right. So everywhere we've been able to look, and again, often we're limited by data in terms of where we can look. Everywhere we've been able to look, we've seen this relationship. So it does not appear to differ based on culture. And even within the U.S., you can look in cities, you can look in rural areas, you can look in richer counties or poorer counties, you see the same response. So it does seem to be a fundamental human physiological response to hot temperatures.
And I know that you've also done some work on infant mortality. And is that simply another... Is that the same issue, or do you think there are other factors that are contributing to the infant mortality associations with climate change? Well, first of all, what are the associations?
Yeah, so that's right. Infant mortality, you could think of it as one other aspect of things we care about, and we think of infant mortality as, luckily in most of the developing world, infant mortality rates have come down by roughly 50% over the last 15 decades. 15 years. It's been this huge public health success. But it's still affected by many environmental factors, and that's what we try to study. And indeed, we see increases in infant mortality as you change the climate. And this is something that countries with currently high infant mortality are still going to struggle with as temperatures warm.
And presumably this is some combination of the effects on the food supply, perhaps the effects on the human physiology of the brain, as you were just discussing, and probably other effects as well. Have people teased that out? Is it important to tease that out?
I think it is important to tease that out because it has an effect on what you do about it, how you try to adapt. So you're right, it's a combination of effects on the food supply, effects on infectious disease, so pushing disease vectors around, mosquitoes, and then direct physiological effects, right? So you could be sort of directly affected by very hot temperatures.
This is The Future of Everything. I'm Russ Altman, more with Marshall Burke about climate change and its impacts, especially on human endeavors, next on SiriusXM Insight 121.
The Future of Everything with Russ Altman from the campus of Stanford University.
Welcome back to The Future of Everything. I'm Russ Altman. I'm speaking with Marshall Burke about climate change, and we were just getting into infant mortality, where your group published a study recently about really kind of digging into what the mechanisms and associations with infant mortality and climate change are. So can you tell us about that study, and what did you learn?
Yeah, so the study took a slightly different tack. So here we weren't directly looking at the impacts of temperature, as we had discussed before. We're looking at something else that's actually related to temperature in a really important way. So we're actually looking at the effects of air pollution on infant mortality. So why is that related? The reason we got interested in this is, well, number one, we care about infant mortality. I have young children. This is clearly a thing we care about as humans. But second, it has a really important climate implication. So when you combust something, you emit CO2, and that's...
Combust is the same as burn.
Yeah, combust. That's right. Normal people say burn. That's right. Just as they say rainfall for preset.
Excuse
burn.
me.
Thank you. When you burn something, you, depending on what you burn, you emit long-lived greenhouse gases. These are the ones we typically think of. CO2 sticks around the atmosphere for decades and warms the planet slowly, right? So you have this sort of long-term, typically cost associated with the CO2 that you emit. But when you burn something, you also emit other things, and some of these things are really important and have other health consequences. So we think of these typically as pollution. So you emit particulate matter, for instance. And this particulate matter can have immediate impacts on outcomes that we care about. So we don't have to wait 20, 30, 50 years to see these impacts. We see them immediately. So what our paper tried to understand...
So these are particles that are not really going up into the stratosphere and shielding the sun from the Earth and changing the ozone layer and stuff like that. But there's stuff that we're breathing, probably. Going into our lungs.
Going into our lungs, often going into our lungs. It can block the sunlight too, so that's an important part. But yeah, think about the first order impact is this is stuff we're breathing in. We burn stuff, we breathe in the particulates that's coming off that combustion. Okay, so what do those particulates do? How big of an effect do they have on outcomes that we care about? So we know intuitively breathing dirty air is bad. No surprise there.
And there's a great literature I know on women in the developing world who use wood-burning stoves indoors have terrible rates of cancer and emphysema and other...
That's exactly right. So the indoor part of this has been studied really well. So what happens when you burn something inside in a closed environment and breathe those? What happens to women? What happens to kids? What we had less of a handle on is outdoor air pollution. So here, let's think of air pollution from, or particulate matter from transportation infrastructure or from a power plant that's 50 miles away or something. That's going to be outdoor ambient air pollution. How does that affect at broad scale these outcomes that we care about? So that's what this paper did. It tried to quantify the relationship between particulate matter and infant mortality across all of sub-Saharan Africa. So here we took a continental-wide look, and we put together survey data, like household-level data across 30 countries in sub-Saharan Africa, and it allowed us to answer with a lot of detail what that relationship looks like.
Do you have air quality detectors speckled throughout Africa?
No, and the fundamental problem, and probably the reason why the study had not been done, is those do not exist in sub-Saharan Africa. What we do have is new satellite-based measures of air pollution, which is what allowed this study. And so satellites here, again, are sort of rewriting the books on what's possible in terms of measuring some of these exposures, and we were able to take advantage of that in this study. And what we find is these really, really strong relationships between dirty air and child health. So as air gets dirtier, more kids are affected, no surprise there. But the effects are really large. And if we simulate a world in which you were able to clean up all of that air, take all the particulates out of it, we would reduce African infant mortality by 20%, right? So 1 in 5 African infant deaths are attributable just to poor air quality.
Now, you said huge. You said the impacts are huge, and you just gave me some. Are there other quantitative measures of what you mean by the huge impact of the particulate air on child health?
Yeah, it's the huge there comes from the study's estimates of what happens or what's the benefit you get if you were to clean up the air.
Clean it up. And that's going from whatever it is now to pretty much perfectly clean.
Right. So that's going to be impossible, but that's sort of the thought experiment. So if you were able to do that, that would save about 20% of overall African infant deaths, which is a really huge number. We can also look at smaller improvements, so something on par with the U.S.'s Clean Air Act that happened in the 1970s, right? Something we think of as policy achievable, something that might be implementable. And there we see reductions of 5 to 10% in African infant mortality if we were able to do something like the Clean Air Act across sub-Saharan Africa.
Still again, very significant.
Huge effects.
Huge,
huge,
on
millions
par
of
with
lives.
Wiping out certain diarrheal diseases or other infectious diseases.
So we find that there's actually larger than the effects of population-wide vaccination efforts,
which are known to be hugely cost-effective for population health.
Which are known to be hugely effective, that's right. more effective than having everyone under a bed net, for instance.
Again, also a hugely cost-effective intervention for malaria and other, vector-borne diseases.
That's exactly right. So that's why we say huge. That's why we say the effects of
So
air
you
pollution
do mean
are
huge.
I do mean huge.
This is The Future of Everything. I'm Russ Altman. I'm speaking with Marshall Burke, and we're talking about this amazing impact of pollution on infant mortality and presumably child health as well. Okay, and you made a little bit of a gesture towards interventions, and I'd like to kind of wrap up our discussion thinking about, as you look at this, obviously a lot of people are thinking about remediating global warming and climate change.
Right.
Are there things short of that governments can do or that individuals can do to try to improve their lot while we're trying to get over on the general? While we're searching for a general solution to climate change, is there things we can do on a more local, regional, national level to kind of mitigate these issues?
Yes, there are many things we can do. What my research is most useful in is thinking about how much of them should we do? How much should be what actions should we be taking, and what should we be willing to pay to take those actions, right? So you could think of my research as informing what are the benefits from undertaking some mitigation effort, right? Be it, so in California, Jerry Brown on Monday just committed us to going carbon-free by 2045 and getting a lot more electric cars on the road, right? So that's one action. It's going to be costly to do that, right? So if you undertake that action, the hope is that the benefits from undertaking it exceed the costs, right? So what our research does is really help us quantify the benefits and to help us understand then how much should you be willing to pay now to undertake these mitigations for some future stream of benefits, right? And the air pollution study we were just talking about suggests that a lot of these benefits you're going to get are not going to be 20, 30, 50, 100 years down the line. They're going to happen literally today. They're going to happen right when you undertake the mitigation action. So this could fundamentally change the cost-benefit calculation.
And it's a lot easier for people to understand and sign on to because it's an immediate benefit. And as we know, people are very bad they're very good at discounting future badness and not really considering it, whereas everybody gets current badness.
That's exactly right. And people understand that air quality is bad, bad air quality is bad, and want better air. And so this is something that I think people sort of viscerally feel that these things would help them immediately.
So your comment about looking at the cost of these interventions and kind of prioritizing the most cost-effective one, that's very compelling. And it forces me to ask you, I feel compelled to ask you, has society made some decisions that you're now wondering might not have been the most cost-effective? Like we all might have thought, oh, this is motherhood and apple pie, we should do this. But actually you would say, you know what, those resources would be better spent somewhere else. Are we making any mistakes?
I would say in the climate domain, our biggest mistake is not doing more. I think all our evidence would suggest that the benefits vastly exceed the costs of a lot of the mitigation options we have on the table. So I'm definitely not worried about overinvestment in mitigation. I'm worried about underinvestment and very worried about underinvestment, especially as the father of two 5-year-old girls who are going to live through this, right? We need to be doing more.
And a lot of the estimates of badness are happening around 2050, which I remember when I first heard these estimates, it was like, well, that's forever, but now that's 30-ish years away. And as you said, your 5-year-old children will be middle-aged. They will barely be middle-aged in 2050.
That's right.
So the first thing is that we need to invest more. You're not seeing, I guess this is good news, you're not seeing big misguided efforts where it's simply unlikely to be cost effective. And in fact, what I'm hearing is that some of these efforts, which have the long game in mind, are going to have other benefits that are much more short term.
That's right. And when we take those benefits into account, I think we're going to quickly realize that we should be doing more than we are.
Thank you for listening to The Future of Everything. I'm Russ Altman. If you missed any of this episode, listen anytime on demand with the SiriusXM app.